Joining us on Talking Sense today, Director of the Middle East and Africa Research Institute, Benji Shulman. Hello, Benji. Great to have you on.
Hi, Gabriel. Great to be here. Thanks so much.
So, Benji, you're going to tell us about the Trump Gaza plan. So let's start by just you providing an outline of what the plan actually is and what the intention behind the plan is.
Thanks, Gabriel. Yeah, so as you're aware, we're now into nearly 2 years of fighting since October 7th, 2023, between the members of the Israeli Defense Forces and Hamas in Gaza. And of course, it's been a really devastating war for the civilians of Gaza, and there has been a push to see how they might be able to find a way to end the war. And the big goals, particularly from the Israeli side, have been: can they get the hostages back? And can they make sure that Hamas is no longer a threat, first of all, to Israeli civilians, but also not have effective control of Gaza? And I think that this plan from the Americans is an attempt to do that, whilst also getting a lot of the regional players on board to support a version of what they like to refer to as the day after.
But this isn't the first kind of peace plan that has been proposed, and this isn't the first plan that's been proposed to kind of deal with the issues of Gaza. So how is this plan different to some of the other plans that have been proposed to sort out the kind of the issues here?
So previously, the approach had always been that there were these sort of short ceasefires with small numbers of hostages that were being released. And then the idea would be that you try and get a sort of longer term process going. And that never seemed to sort of get off the ground. You did get some short term ceasefires, some hostages got out, but then the fighting would always sort of return. This is different because what they're saying is, when all the hostages out, because there's not that many living ones left, there's about 20 from the estimates, and then there's a bunch of dead bodies that are being held. So the idea is to get them all out, and also at the same time then have Hamas disarm, decommission its weapons, and then also potentially apply for amnesty, leave the Strip, whatever. So the difference in approach here is, first of all, that it's a sort of one big bang as opposed to a little drip thing, and then also to get the regional players on board, in that the Arab countries and Qatar in particular, who's sort of acted as a player and a referee in this, to actually be on board for it as well. So that's where the differences are.
And is this plan likely to succeed in your estimation? Like, how do you think things play out?
Well, what's different about this plan, again, is that first of all, it's one that Trump has really sort of signed his name onto, so the Americans are very invested in it. The Israelis seem to be happy with it. That wasn't always the case with some of the previous plans. And the region is supportive. So we're not just talking about the Arab countries here, sort of Egypt, Jordan, UAE, who's a big player, but also Qatar, who's sort of acted as somewhat of a mediator, somewhere between a mediator and supporting Hamas at the same time. So, but also you've seen Turkey, Pakistan. So the whole region, plus Israel, plus the Americans are on board. Now the question is Hamas going to bite?
Yeah, and I think that is actually the next question I was going to ask you, because a lot of the kind of, let's say, mainstream response has been to say, okay, well, this plan is all well and good, but it's going to be impossible without Hamas's sign-on. And I think that slightly absurd line, because it's a plan that's there to get rid of Hamas's influence in the Gaza Strip, and so it's kind of like you saying, well, the Turkeys need to vote for Christmas before we can have Christmas. But do you think it is significant that Hamas accept it? And
yeah, I don't know whether Hamas will accept this particular outcome, but I think what the plan does is it kind of stakes out two different futures for the Strip. On the one hand, if you look at the plan, there's lots of room for aid, lots of room for rebuilding, lots of room for a technocratic government to come in and run the place in a way that's safe for everybody. So that builds out the kind of future that the Strip could have. Or the other option is just basically what Trump has said, is that they're going to give carte blanche to Israel to continue the military campaign in Gaza City. And that's very serious urban warfare that would be very difficult, both for the Israelis to have to fight, but also for the civilians that are still stuck in that part of the Strip. So I think it's signaling to the international community a kind of very stark choice. You
Mm.
can go away that would be peaceful and prosperous and forward future, or we carry on doing what we were doing before. And Hamas has that choice.
But the plan does have some kind of parts of it that say, well, even if Hamas doesn't agree to it, what we're going to do is start initiating the plan in the parts of Gaza that are IDF controlled. And so, do you see a world in which, you kind of start off with Hamas rejecting it, but the plan gets implemented, and then its successful implementation breeds kind of more desire on the Gazan population to see wider execution of the plan?
Parts of the strip are already, as you say, about 75% of the strip is already either under Israeli control or under control of some of these other tribal groups or other kinds of groups that are operating. And that's, you're already seeing in those places an improvement on what you had before.
Mm.
So when they talk about the plan being implemented, I think in some respects it's kind of already being done. But at the same time, you would then have a proper military operation happening in the more northern parts of the strip. So I suspect that would be part of how they start to do it. And I also think that they try and get then the civilians that are moved out of the city, which they have been, probably maybe start trying to come south and be away from the fighting, which has been a big problem since the beginning of the war.
And talk to us about the South African government's response or lack thereof. Given that they have been one of the loudest voices shouting at the Israelis, now there seems to be a legitimate path to peace, and they're staying kind of stuck. What do you make of that?
I mean, this has been the critique of the South African position kind of from the beginning. The last thing that I've seen coming out of the South Africans on this issue was their support for this flotilla or all these ships with Greta Thunberg, delivering aid, whatever that means, because there's not much aid that she's going to be able to deliver to try and sort of break the blockade. That's been the South African approach, this very obstructionist, aggressive, okay, we're going to be on the side of the Hamas supporters kind of regardless. And now when there's a genuine peace offer on the table and a way to take the place forward, unsurprisingly, the South Africans haven't been consulted because they're not seen as a proper, honest broker and people who are doing the right thing here.
And with regards to the flotilla that you mentioned, what do you make of something like that? I think this is flotilla 2,
3, 4. There's been a few attempts in the last while for flotillas. The most famous one was about 10 years ago. There's something called the Mavi Marvara, which actually ended up in people being killed because they attacked troops that were trying to board the ship. And to be honest, I think that's probably what these flotillas want. They're looking for a big confrontation and a lot of, unfortunately, blood shed so that they can get an international incident. The previous one with Greta Thunberg she came on 1 or 2 ships, something like that, and they boarded it and they gave her a turkey sandwich or something and then got her on a flight and flew back home. And it was a joke. People were talking about it as a selfie yacht more than a flotilla. And they've had all sorts of issues. One part of the flotilla has complained that another part has like a gay rights activist on it, and as an Islamist, he's not prepared to be part of that. And there's been like a lot of like internal fighting because it's a lot of ships and a lot of different players. And the question will be, can you accommodate the security forces in Israel? Can they get aboard these ships safely and make sure that the stuff can get delivered, which I think it will be, but that they don't get into the strip and put themselves in danger as well as everybody else. Interestingly, I saw the son of one of the Hamas leaders who sort of changed his mind about this whole thing. He's a very interesting character, but he's called on a bunch of Israeli boats to now go out into like the waters to meet all of these other ships. And so you've got all of these sort of amateur sailors who are getting on ships to go out there in Israeli flags. I don't know what it's going to look like, but kind of Dunkirk type thing out there in the open sea. So we'll have to see.
And you mentioned Qatar earlier. Can you tell us just about the significance of Qatar to the whole kind of peace process that we're going to see unfold?
Yeah, so Qatar is a very crucial point about this. They like to kind of project themselves as being the Switzerland of the Middle East, right? You've got this, it's quite a small country. It's on the border of Iran, as between Iran and Saudi Arabia, really.
Mm-hmm.
And they understood early on that when you're that small in the Middle East, then you get eaten. And so what they very cleverly did is they took the tremendous oil and gas wealth that they've been able to produce over the years, and they invested it in two things. The first is transport and telecommunications, so
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of planes are going through them as a hub. And the second thing that they invested in is Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera is extremely well funded and is comes across as highly credible, but in fact, Qatar is state-based uh, a state-based broadcaster,
Mm.
and you can't in a dictatorship, effectively, an
Yeah.
autocracy. And so you can't speak outside of the mandate of the Qatari government. And so what you'll find, for example, in Al Jazeera, is that the Arabic version of whatever they're talking about will be one message, and the English version will be something else.
Mm.
So, for example, there was a famous LGBTI activist in Egypt who died, and
Mm-hmm.
in the English broadcast, it was all about how brave and beautiful this person was, and how they, worked in Egypt to get rights for people. And in the Arabic version, it was like this person was against God, and they got everything they deserved. And so it was two completely different messages for two completely different audiences.
Yeah.
And so they use Al Jazeera to drive the narrative all over the world to figure out what they're going to do from the Qatari state perspective.
Mm.
And it's not just this as an influence operation. They fund Middle East study centers in the US. Even in South Africa, they have a few universities who have Qatari money, and they use this to project influence. Now, why this is important is that Qatar is from the same ideological camp as Hamas. They're not necessarily violent in the same way, but they're sort of connected to what's known as the Muslim Brotherhood, which is this Islamist way of thinking about the world. Hamas is a violent version of that, and they are obviously not so violent as a state. But effectively, they kind of play referee and player, because on the one hand they host Hamas and they are allowed to live there and whatever, but then they also act as a mediator to do something. So on the one hand, the people in the region have no choice but to use Qatar as a mediating point, but on the other hand, they're also actually supportive of Hamas at the same time. And what's been significant about this plan is that the Israelis were asked to apologize for that strike where they try to kill the remaining Hamas people in Qatar.
Mm-hmm.
Qatar was very upset about that, to the extent that you now have this bizarre situation with Qatar, who finances the UEFA, the European Football Association.
Yeah.
Qatar is now pushing UEFA to kick Israel out of UEFA, and there's a vote on that in the next sort of couple of weeks. And that could be a big issue. But the fact that Qatar is pushing the European Soccer League to push them out as a punishment for having tried to blow up Hamas in Qatar is like quite a very interesting dynamic. But basically, that apology that was read out to Qatar is a way of getting them on board with the plan. And now they've been reticent, but basically they've signed on as well. And so they're a crucial player in order to for this plan to work in any way, shape, or form. You needed Qatar to be on board.
And that relationship you say between Qatar and Hamas, can you just maybe flesh it out a little bit more? Why is it that you say they're from the kind of same ideological background, but with this kind of one reads stories about how Iranian money might be coming via Qatar. How is it that Qatar does actually wield such a heavy influence over Hamas?
So primarily before October 7th, there was a kind of situation in which Qatar was sending money to the Israelis, who were then putting the money into the Strip. And the idea is that, well, if there's lots of money flowing into the Strip, people won't be desperate, and then there won't be any problems. Effectively, the Israelis were trying to buy off Hamas using Qatari money. And in fact, on the day of October 7th, or just before that, there was a negotiation to get more Palestinians into Israel from Gaza so that they could work and do jobs and whatever. But that had never been Hamas's interest. Hamas's interest is about eradicating Israel from the area.
Yeah.
And so Qatar was because they sympathetic to Hamas's political aims, what we would call Islamist aims. So what does that mean? It's an ideological positioning that looks to run the society in a way that is in line with Islamic law. So, to be sort of simplistic about it, if you're a Muslim, that's a religion. You pray 5 times a day. You don't eat pork. You give to charity. That's a Muslim religious viewpoint.
Yeah.
Islamists are people who wish to impose that system on the society, including on non-Muslims, and make it part of the political architecture, if you like. And jihadis are people who are interested in doing that in a violent fashion.
Okay.
So you could think about Qatar as the Islamists who are not violent, and Hamas as the jihadis who are. And that's kind of a differentiation, but it's a differentiation in terms of action as opposed to belief.
Yeah, it's a kind of like a sliding scale of where do you land? Are you the non-violent or violent part of the same ideology?
Exactly.
And so with Qatar kind of reticently on board, are we going to be seeing kind of peace in the region, in the Gaza Strip imminently? Do you think?
Look, it never pays to bet on peace in the Middle East, regardless of where it is at. This is a positive step forward. I think having the Qataris on board is important because they obviously host Hamas. So, like, if they really got very annoyed, they could just kick them out the country, and that might cause issues. And so, it does add pressure to Hamas. The problem is that Hamas only have one bargaining chip. That's the 20 live hostages, and to an extent, some of the dead ones as well. But really, the live hostages are the bargaining chip. As soon as Hamas give that away, then they have no ability to take on Israel or take on, this plan calls for Arab forces to come and run the area. They've got no ability to really drive anyone out. And so from the beginning of the war, there's always been this tension between the two war aims, which is on the one hand, we want to get the hostages out. On the other hand, you want to disarm Hamas. You can do each one of those things fairly simply.
Yeah.
But it's difficult to do both without Hamas's consent, if you like. And I think the way to think about this for people who might be a bit like confused as to why someone wouldn't just say, let's stop the war, stop the suffering of the civilians, and try and rebuild the place, is to think about it as Japan just before the dropping of the atomic bomb, right? The island is surrounded. The Americans have destroyed everything. And now if this island gets invaded, it's going to be a horrific prospect for all involved. And the Japanese were, fairly happy to have that continue potentially.
Yeah.
And that same sort of fanatic attitude is what's driving Hamas at the moment. And they may sadly see it as an advantage to continue having destruction in the Strip because it would turn global public opinion further against the war and allow them to try and achieve some of their aims as they're doing it. So there perversely may actually be an incentive for Hamas not to take this deal.
I think I would agree with you, and I mean I think you've seen it kind of in they've demonstrated that over and over again that there's been opportunities for them to have a more or less peaceful resolution, and every time they have not gone the full, they haven't done enough to secure the peace, and it seems as though that if you keep repeating that course of action, then that seems to be the course of action you want to achieve.
And they've also said very openly that the Hamas people in Qatar who are living there who are different in the sense that they're not living in the Strip and they're quite wealthy and whatever, and they kind of are still openly proud about October 7th and the fact that it happened. And the guys in the Strip have said, well, we'll do it again if we get the opportunity. So they're not being coy about what their goals are here. And you're right, they haven't really they could have got a lot out of just returning the hostages. Even under this deal, I can't remember how many it is, something like 250 hardened criminals, people who have blood on their hands, would be traded for these sort of women and children and elderly hostages that are left. But for Hamas, that may still not be enough to actually say, let's cease the fighting.
Yeah, and maybe it's just the thought that, well, if eventually we do give, as you say, we have only one bargaining chip, it's the hostages. If we give the hostages away, then the IDF has full liberty if they want to knock us into the previous century.
Well, this plan does come with amnesty for people who give up, and safe passage out of the strip for the leaders. But again, this is a group of people who don't necessarily consider dying to be a problematic outcome. If you can die as a martyr, that's seen as a positive thing. If you read into the early Islamist writers, one of the critiques they have against kind of Judeo-Christian civilization is that he's quite open about it. The problem is with these people is they like life far too much. It's like that's the phrase he uses. Whereas our way, the Islamist way, is to die for the glory of Allah, right? And that's how they think, is that this is not necessarily an outcome. It might actually be an incentive.
Yeah, wow. And so a last question for you is, we've got this weird thing happening where, people in the West who have been claiming that the Israelis have been committing a genocide and that, the kind of destruction of Gaza is so complete, are now turning around and being offered the first real substantial peace plan with regional acceptance. Almost everyone on side of the peace plan, they're now recommending and saying, no, don't accept the peace plan. It looks basically because Trump was one of the leaders of it. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Trump element is part of that, but I think there's a broader thing going on, because it's not just campus activists who are saying this. They are saying it, but not the only ones. If you ask people in Gaza, they've sort of tweeted out to people in Gaza, what do you think of the plan? And there's been like, yeah, let's just, like, whatever we need to do to stop the fighting, let's stop the fighting and go from there. But you've had like senior people in Spain and a number of other countries saying, no, we have to, this is unacceptable. And kind of the question you got to ask is, what is unacceptable about this plan? And I think it's, yes, they don't like the fact that Trump has brought it, but I also think that they appreciate the opportunities that they get to be in front of cameras and raise funds and go out and march and have legitimacy to do anti-Semitic things that we've seen and whatever under the cover of this war. And so they're benefiting in some perverse way from the images, terrible images that are coming out of the war, because they can drive their own, even domestic agendas. You're seeing this stuff play out in political races and, in even New York, it's become part of the discussion. So in a sort of horrifying way, it actually, a peaceful outcome with Hamas removed and the hostages returned would be something that would not benefit them. They don't have an interest in that outcome.
I think it demonstrates perfectly the perverse incentive structures that have been set up by a lot of these activist groups across the West, claiming that they want peace and on the one hand, and then as soon as a legitimate peace deal comes, well, if they accept that, then, as you said, all of our incentives go away, all of the attention, all of the money we can raise. We are nothing without this war and the ability to critique Israel every day, every moment of every day.
And also their baseline idea is not when they talk about peace, what they're talking about is that they want Israel to disappear. That's what they're saying, right? So there's like an old joke in the Middle East where there's two guys talking, right? Mm-hmm. They're standing on two different parts of land. And the one guy's putting out his hand, he says, well, we really want peace. And the other guy says, yes, but I want that peace. And I think that's sort of the attitude that we're seeing here,
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today and talking us through all of this, Benji. I think it's fascinating, and I do think that it seems to be the first real glimmer of hope that things might actually change in Gaza to such an extent that we don't get a repeat of October 7th and then the war that follows.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that this will be the first step towards something more peaceful than we've had before. Thank you for the time, Gabriel.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I've been Gabriel Macon, and this has been Talking Sense.